those 12, 13 young guys and girls, that most of them, not all of them, most of them found employment after through our assistance of networking and sort of referring them and facilitating interviews and helping them with CVs and skills and how to dress and take them to the interviews and so on. But it became a bit of
that's a big deal.
Yeah,
because as you said, these might be young people whose parents never worked.
That's right. Yeah.
And their grandparents may not have worked. So that's a really big deal.
Yeah. And the other thing is that the cafe itself became a bit of a focal point of the area, because I mean, when there's a big development happening in the community, it's very disruptive. Apart from the noise, the dust, the machinery, and someone is against, someone is happy, and it's a very particular community, and so it's very disruptive. But that became a bit of a focal point. So it wasn't just the workers going there. The entire community was going there in the morning, and so everyone knew each other by name, and you know, like Shane, the chef, was the focus there, and everyone knew him and shook hands to everyone. So it was amazing, and so it became this focal point of new beginning in a way for that space. And the great thing that I'm really proud of is that now we actually, as the construction zone wrapped up, we actually built a cafe within the public library space there in Riverwood, and we're living it there as a legacy. We continue to run it as a social enterprise. Right. So not only because that's the risk, a developer goes on site, does their thing, and then they move away. We actually have left a legacy, and we continue to manage it, and we continue to employ young people and train them. And so that's important as we move as well somewhere else and do the same thing and replicate it. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, I'm just going to shift to Kylie, and then I'm going to open up to the floor for you to ask some questions. So I hope you've been making some notes and you've got some questions ready. We'll have a couple of very willing runners to help with the mics, but give you an opportunity to ask the panellists some questions yourselves. So Kylie, you both work, as Catherine talked about before, there's Paediatra, which is the bringing together of researchers and practitioners, trying to shorten that space or that distance between evidence and practice. Somebody once told me that on average it takes 17 years to get evidence into practice. So I guess you're trying to shorten that a bit. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit about that, but also I know you've worked a lot on the ground with Indigenous communities. So following up from what Andre's just said, and Danny, about how important it is to work and understand the communities you're in before you launch into just doing something.
Thank you. Look, I think it's a paradox that the very best scientists are often the most reluctant to take on change, and the 17 years remains true that the evidence, for example, around things like hand washing to prevent infection, spread of infection, has been well known for decades, and yet it's still not consistently applied. And so I think that challenge to move from what we know to what we do is a really huge chasm. And that whilst we all know here that collaboration and collective work delivers much better outcomes and often at a much more efficient cost and has a whole range of corollary benefits, that it's still at the margins of social programs. And I think moving kind of innovation and collaboration from the margins to standard practice is really our challenge. And we're very lucky to have Ben right in the centre of things in New South Wales, because I think that part of our challenge in moving from the margins to the centre is about the policy and funding levers that in fact promote and entrench competition between the players, and then actually getting players to collaborate becomes very, very challenging. That who's going to hold the money and who's got the power and who's going to do the decision making. And so I think we do have to address those kind of big funding and policy levers at the policy level. Just to move down to the kind of grassroots level, my thesis was on collective impact, but it kind of grew from a body of work around how we engage with communities to design and deliver programs that are both more effective and more efficient. And through the Poach Centre for Indigenous Health at Sydney University, we established a dental program in the middle of nowhere with a group of communities. And the way that we originally imagined this was a clinic, and people would come to the clinic and they would get the best care, and everyone would have better teeth. But of course, because we were committed to a collective impact process, that we took the time to engage properly and understand what people wanted. And in fact, what we've ended up with is, 24 portable dental kits, and who would have known that you can kind of plug and play with dentistry, but you can. A little box that would fit in the overhead compartment of a aeroplane, you can do dentistry with one of those now. So we kind of combine technology with the wishes of the community to have dentistry within walking distance. So now there are kind of little tiny dental kits located in cupboards all around remote New South Wales. And that in doing that, the process of actually having the dialogue and deciding on the model of care, that does take a long time, and that we started collecting data from the beginning, and we were thinking, gee, we're going to have a real problem with our efficiency figures, so we better do a cost study. So we looked at 2 years of data from the first conversation for 2 years going forward, and because dentistry is such a privatised industry, every single thing that happens in the mouth has a price and a code. And so the data collection is actually very solid. So we compared the first 2 years of data with 2 years from the fly-in, fly-out service in New South Wales intended for Aboriginal people. And we're completely gobsmacked by the findings that using a community-driven model with a commitment to 50% local staff, we delivered 47% more treatment at 25% of the cost. Wow. Now, we knew it would be cheaper, we already knew it was better, but the fact that it's more efficient, I think, goes to that sense that in fact collaboration does take time, and real collaboration does mean sharing power and money and all of those things. But in fact, if you do it well, you can end up with both a more effective outcome and a more efficient outcome.
Fantastic story. Just, give the clap. That's just... So how did you get people to share that power and remove their self-interest and share the costs, etc.?
So I think that part of it was having philanthropy involved, that I think private funding is critical in terms of being able to shape and define the conversation. For us, we had the happy circumstance of a perfect storm, minister's electorate, unhappy stakeholders, upcoming election, and so those things all help.
That's what you need, a burning platform, perfect.
And that I think that is part of what collaboration...
We need to get smarter around utilising those things.
It's true, isn't it? That it's part of collaboration being at the margins, that we have to capitalise on these opportunities that present themselves and say, right, let's grab this one. And that what was interesting about that was that we did from the outset have this absolute commitment around 50% local staff, and there was kind of a whole lot of scoffing about that, as you can imagine. And we started off with a scholarship program for just 15 young people about training to become dental assistants and other health paraprofessionals. But through that program, there's now 350 Aboriginal people across New South Wales who've been qualified as health paraprofessionals. And of course, that then has a layering impact in terms of the cultural competence of services, economic participation, the way that we design and deliver services, and it becomes a kind of virtuous circle there where the people delivering the services are the people that live in the community, and I think that's really critical to effective community-based work.
Hello, Ian Keddy, I'm the CFO at Mission Australia. Question really for Greg, and perhaps Ben might want to comment too. If it takes 17 years to get evidence into practice, I suspect it's similar to get bankers to understand the risks. And I think that's one of the key issues, particularly in social impact investing, where I've heard comments from the from investors in the market saying returns are great, better than average, which tells me they don't understand the risks yet. So any comments about where you think the financial community is on the journey to truly understand risks in relation to impact investing?
I think there's a long way to go, but we can help that process along. When I first started community sector banking, which was now on 17 years ago, 18, whatever it is, but it was really interesting because we tried to do some work in social housing and affordable housing, and the first comment that came back from Bendigo, which was seen as an investor in community, I suppose, was that we can't manage the reputational risk. What happens if it fails? What happens if we're going to sick somebody out? And that was a real problem that we needed to actually really drill down. But it was an effort, and they needed to make a conscious effort to understand the risk. And I think that in a lot of cases, if there's no compelling need to do that, then it's very difficult for somebody to say, well, you know, I've got so much capital, I have to spend my capital wisely, and that means I'm going to actually invest in what I know. For others, it's actually about this is an investment in society and we need to actually change it. But it is then a time period to, if you like, de-risk some of the stuff initially to ensure that what we're doing actually meets the kind of criteria, because over a period of time you'll find that the risk and the impact actually is investable, because the economic cost benefits can be shared with the investor, with the community as part of that approach. But to transition from today to then is really quite difficult. But it was the same when, you know, initially mortgage-backed securities, for example, when they were first launched some 25, 30 years ago, it had every bell and whistle that you could actually possibly, you know, guaranteed interest cover, all of this kind of enhancements and credit risk and changing mortgages and different pools. Why? Because the market didn't understand the risk. And so, but it took, you know, for that, probably only 3 or 4 years for the risk to be understood, and then the market was actually really quite active in that space. This, well, as you say, I've been still pushing and pushing and pushing, and I think this collaboration of different streams of capital is perhaps the answer to build the market and to a point where everybody actually understands what that risk is. So a bit of time yet, but it can be done.
Ben, I think you want to, yeah.
Yeah, can I just add, there's just a parallel, I think, with public-private partnerships, which have been done for years in infrastructure. It took time. I think it's very, very well understood now. I'll just echo a lot of what Greg would say. I think as government, we need to be smarter about ourselves understanding the risks and which risks are appropriate to transfer to investors and which risks are not. I know the banks are having a hard time, but actually, a lot of the ones I deal with are pretty good people. They want to engage, they actually want to understand this, but they need us to help them understand what risks they're engaged in. So it's a two-way, but I think that kind of PPP parallel and history, and it will be massively accelerated this time around, means actually I'm pretty encouraged.
Thank you. Annabelle Daniel from Women's Community Shelters. I think many of us that are working in the space of community development, capacity building, feel like we are planting the seeds of trees that we will never sit under. It's a very long-term kind of process, building capacity in communities, seeing those outcomes. What I would like to ask the panel from your extensive knowledge is, how do we do that against a backdrop that feels like politics is speeding up? There's an increasing churn, there's a want for quick wins, there's an incredibly fast political cycle, and quite frankly, there's a lot of organisational, both governmental, NGO, ego involved. How do we get through all of that?
Great question. Go, Carly.
Look, I think I would describe myself as the most impatient person in Australia, and that who would then decide to work in this space of collective impact and community development and capacity building. But I think that, in fact, it is that impatience that's important. And for me personally, it's what's keeping the eye on the big prize, or the set of prizes, if you like, and then what are the little wins along the way. So my new role at Paediatrio, one of the things we're trying to deliver for Australian children is precision medicine, which is using genetics to make sure that treatment specifically is designed around those particular children. Now, if you take that on, you think, wow, that is just the most enormous task. But in fact, if you slice it down to one small problem, so we're about to start a trial where children in Australia will, for the first time, will have access to gene therapy around a particular set of conditions, that set of success then enables hope to build from. And I think that, in a sense, in this space, you have to retain that sense of optimism and hope, and that for me it's about those small successes along the way, because I'm always calling out bad behaviour and kind of, being the bad cop, saying, no, we're not doing that, and no, the community wants that. So in a sense, you have to constantly be the bad cop whilst retaining this sense of great optimism that this is worth doing and it's worth hanging in there to achieve it.
Yeah, I'd like to explore that, because I think that bad cop and that question you raised about the ego and the self-interest has come up today. It's a really important thing, because it is a huge barrier to working collaboratively and to often progressing things. It's fundamental to the way our society works, where so many industries are private sector, like dental, which is about maximising individual profits. How do we overcome those things? And I'd like. Yes.
I just wanted to, I don't know if it answers what you just said, but I just wanted to link to Annabelle's question about the impatience. And, we like always to say that we like to work both at the systemic level, but also on the trenches, on the ground, and get things done. And they're both just as challenging, I suppose. But one thing that I think sometimes philanthropic support can enable is just getting things done in a way. Philanthropic support can also help systemic changes, obviously, because it's money that doesn't necessarily require a return, and it just can be larger than and more patient in a way. But it can also get on the ground and get things done. So with Annabelle, for example, we were supporting women community shelters in the hills with a sanctuary, and a need became quite obvious from them, and that there was a gap for women leaving shelters and needing to go back into community. A transitional bit, like a gap of a time where they weren't quite ready to go into the community and redevelop their own life with their children. And what do developers have? They've got properties and roofs, right? So it became really just, we don't need to start changing the world straight away. We get down on the ground, and we got together with Annabelle and Bridge Housing, and we formed this partnership called Pathways Home. You referred to it before. We basically make available properties that are sitting there waiting to be redeveloped, and instead of being rented out on the private market or just collecting dust for a few years until all the planning things line up, we make them available to women community shelters, women that with their children come out of emergency accommodation and rebuild their lives. It didn't take much. It took a few months because the lawyers got in the way, but really, it took longer to develop a document than the actual thing to get it done. And it's one of the simplest things. It's self-sustainable. Right. It doesn't need any money, really. It just needs the foregoing of the rent. But that doesn't solve the problem. But it just addresses something, and so. And
it's a quick win.
It's a quick win.
Courage.
And the idea is that now we would like to scale that up, not just for PACE, but for many other developers. There's so many properties out there that are empty, that are waiting to either be knocked down or whatever. Just use them and make them, use the value out of them. So that's a quick. I don't know if it answers any of the question, but I think it's about the patience. Yeah, you want to be patient for the big change, but just get on the ground and get things done, and don't worry about it.
Thank you. Monique Rivera from Create Foundation. I guess my question comes off the back of Annabelle's question around patience and the time that it takes. But my question relates to that community engagement, because we know that's so important and having community buy-in. But how do we keep community engaged on the ground when there is so much time and so much patience is required, when they don't see any change on the ground and any change in their lives in any sort of tangible or real way?
I'll have a quick go, but it's basically what Kylie said earlier, and I think it does link to the previous comment. So firstly, I think when we start on the journey having a realistic narrative, I think part of the problem we fall into is we overpromise. So that would be one, a realism around the timeline. And secondly is, Kylie said that breaking it down into really small parts and celebrating success on the journey. It's really interesting. We have different structures in the social impact investments we've devised, and we found that it's not just about community, but also impatient investors. They want to see results really, really quickly, and we've found that the bonds that seem to be working better are ones where we have exactly the same. One of the beauties of bonds is it's a kind of long-term instrument, not your usual 3-year government contract. But people still want to see success. So breaking down the long-term vision with milestones on the way and having genuine celebration of those milestones. And then just back, because I wanted to say this earlier, we're such a cynical bunch. My one thing about, and I don't care whether it's politicians, we've all got egos, but celebrate success more. The one thing that bugs me is we're all so quick to criticise.
Yeah.
If we could just celebrate success on the way,
Yeah.
and that's how you keep momentum in the long journey.
Yeah, that's so important, Ben. We do need to get, myself included, better at celebrating successes and take a little bit of time out to say, that was really good, and reflect on what did we learn? Why did that work well? Why was that a success? What were the factors that we can then replicate for the next venture, for the next thing that we do? And, have a party. Such a good point. It's so important.
Can I just add to that? There's an expression in politics that's when you get sick of saying it, they're only just starting to hear you. Yeah. So I think that's a really important part of the communication message, is having the narrative, the strong narrative, why are we on the journey, but also it seems like you're constantly repeating it, but it's only just then that you're starting to embed that into the community. And as others have said, it's about celebrating the quick wins and knowing what the quick wins will be so that you can keep them engaged. And by keeping them engaged, you're growing your base, and then the story lives on.
That's right. Kylie, do you want?
I think too that co-design tools are really key to that. So collective impact is the brand, if you like, that I have used, but in a sense it doesn't matter what the brand is. It's about that notion of shared power and decision making. And so it's not our project that we're engaging communities in, it's in fact their project that we're helping with. And that's an important kind of power shift, if you like, and that it's not us filling them in on the results, it's collectively sharing, what are the goals, what are the progresses that we're making, what are the problems and what's next. And that I think the thing that I keep reminding myself and the people that I work with in this space is that if things go wrong in one of our projects, that it's really disappointing for us as workers. We've worked really hard and we've put all of our hard time and effort in to this important thing. But in fact, it's people's lives that we have the privilege of engaging with, and that when things don't work, it has a direct impact on where they live and who they live with and their quality of life. And so I think getting that power balance right from the get-go is critical, and that co-design methods really help us to do that.
Also, just in terms of the continuum, from my mind and my experience, it's the community. It's the individual, it's the couples, it's the family that are the beneficiaries of the services that comes in for that period of time and exit. And if you take away the political cycle of the 3 or 4 year, the end result's still that individual, that couple, that family. So in my mind, we can't lose sight of the end user being the community and using the community as part of that ground up. But I say from top down, community driving that process. And I can say that certainly some of the work that we're overseeing at the moment in New South Wales, that's certainly the case.
I just ask one other thing to that is you don't need to ask permission. I think we get sort of so tied into making change and just the examples that we've had today, people have actually got together. identified who the change makers are, collaborated with community and made it happen. And it was sort of sometimes we sit back and sort of say, well, we wanted to, where's the authority to do this stuff when you don't have to actually ask permission? If it's governed by that, it won't change. Community can drive it. They need to bring community along the journey, but let the community own the journey and give them the powers, empower them to say, how do we make this happen? Don't ask for permission though.
Okay, well, what I might do is just ask the panellists just one quick thing that has struck you from this morning, one each, and just run along from, maybe start with yourself, Greg, while you had the mic there.
I think
as a wrap.
I've over the years I've been to many functions that people talk about this issue, and there's not enough doing. There's not enough sort of let's just make it happen. What are we going to do to bring it together, to collaborate, get those small examples happen and make it happen? And around the room, if you actually thought about how do we collaborate even amongst ourselves to say, let's just make it happen, we could probably do a whole stack of stuff. But I think sometimes we can talk a lot. It's nice to get something done.
Yeah, just do it, yeah. Andrea?
I think probably the bit of cliche, but the embracing the failure and really celebrating the success, like like have a party and celebrating the success, and don't always be overcritical and criticize and attack what could have been done better.
Yeah.
Use that to do something better, but celebrate the positive.
Fantastic.
Positive reinforcement. We use it with our kids,
Yeah,
right? That's what we should. So.
Use it with each other. Ben?
There's too much. But what I think those cases, there's a huge amount of assumed knowledge, and the case study from Kylie, you just think, oh wow. I'll just leave it with wow. You just think, wow, we've got to do more of that.
More of that.
I think for me it's always the importance of private money, that it is often the game changer, and it doesn't have to be in large amounts, but it changes the conversation with public funders about you come to the table with something, a proposal and some cash, and let's see what we can do collectively. So private money.
Fantastic. That's why we're here this morning.
We're not alone. I think it's a community of practice that needs to come together to enable what we've just heard previously. So I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. And Catherine?
Hope springs eternal. And that, there is if you think back on some of the broad social changes that have occurred in the last 10 years in this country, we have achieved quite an amount. And I just think we need to remember things like same-sex marriage, about the investment into disability services and the focus in disability services now being the child and the family, not the service provider. It's struggling as we are with that process, but it's fundamentally the right way to go. So keeping the principles involved and keeping the hope going is great.
Fantastic. Please thank our panellists.